Porphyry's book Against the Christians was so dangerous that 3 Christian emperors wrote decrees ordering it to be burned. As early as the year 324 CE, the Emperor Constantine ordered all copies of Against the Christians to be destroyed and made it a capital offense to possess one in the future. Constantine mentioned Porphyry in a letter to the bishops and to the people of his empire. Quote, Porphyry, that enemy of piety, composed criminal treatises against religion. His impious writings have been destroyed. Apparently, however, some copies of it survived. For over 100 years later, in the year 448, the emperors Theodosius II and Valentinian jointly ordered that Porphyry's work be committed to the flames. To quote their rationale, quote, we do not will that any treatise that stirs God to wrath and harms souls even reach human ears. Probably by the 5th century, then, Christians had succeeded in destroying Porphyry's great work Against the Christians. But they did not destroy or seek to destroy the fragments and traces of the work in Christian authors themselves. Thus, testimonies and fragments of Porphyry's great work survive. This is the material that I translate and comment on in my own translation and reconstruction of Against the Christians. In this episode, I introduce this work as well as Porphyry himself. Porphyry, for those who don't know him, was a Neoplatonist philosopher who flourished in the mid to late 3rd century of the Common Era. He was born in the city of Tyre, on the coast of what is now modern Lebanon. His family was evidently wealthy because he had the finest education anyone could wish for in the ancient world. Credit must, in part, go to Porphyry himself for seeking out the best teachers. The first of these was a student of Ammonius, the greatest Platonist philosopher of the early 3rd century. This famous teacher was located not too far distant from Tyre in the city of Caesarea. His name was Origen of Alexandria, who is now considered a church father, despite his condemnation by the later Emperor Justinian, who reigned between 527 and 565. Now, Origen was a Christian, so there is some suspicion that Porphyry was also a Christian when he met Origen. This would have been when Porphyry was in his late teens. The whole question depends on whether or not Origen accepted non-Christians into his school of learning, which Porphyry apparently entered. There's also a later testimony that Porphyry abandoned Christianity after being beat up by a gang of Christians in Caesarea, where Origen lived. This testimony is traced back to Eusebius of Caesarea. Porphyry himself never mentions this event. At any rate, it was Origen who evidently introduced Porphyry to Platonist writers like Numenius and Cronius, as well as to Stoic writers like Cornutus. But the young Porphyry grew dissatisfied, as he later reflects, with Origen's interpretive methods and way of life. Accordingly, Porphyry sailed to Athens in search of the greatest literary critic of his time, a man called Longinus. Longinus made Porphyry a true grammarian, which is to say, a literary and historical critic. In his time, Longinus was described as a living library and a walking museum. But Longinus was a lover of words more than a lover of wisdom, and Porphyry craved something higher than higher criticism. So he sought out yet another student of Ammonius, the Egyptian Plotinus, who taught at Rome. It was Plotinus who made Porphyry into a philosopher. Over the course of 5 years, between 263 and 268, Porphyry became an intimate disciple of this very first Neoplatonist, so much so that Plotinus entrusted to him the publication of his works. It was Plotinus who called Porphyry a poet, philosopher, and expounder of sacred mysteries. At the end of his first Roman sojourn, around 268, Porphyry began feeling depressed by his own account. He contemplated suicide in Rome, evidently to escape the chains of his body. Plotinus, however, traced his sadness to physiological causes and advised Porphyry to take a holiday in Sicily. This advice proved providential. It saved Porphyry from a hasty suicide, as well as from a massive plague that struck Rome, a plague to which Plotinus himself succumbed, though not before sending Porphyry his final treatises to edit. It would take Porphyry more than 30 years to publish these edited treatises, which he called Enneads. In the meantime, he evidently returned to Rome around 270 and took up teaching where Plotinus left off. It was during this time, between 270 and 300, that Porphyry reportedly taught that other great Neoplatonist, Iamblichus. During this period, Porphyry composed many works, among them our 15-volume work Against the Christians. Now, we don't know exactly what Porphyry called it, but according to the Suda, a 10th century Byzantine dictionary, it was called Against the Christians. We cannot discern Porphyry's express purpose for writing this work, since we lack his preface and most of the book, but we can try to reconstruct it from hints dropped in Porphyry's other works. For instance, in chapter 16 of his Life of Plotinus, Porphyry mentions how Plotinus wrote a treatise which Porphyry entitled Against the Gnostics. This is Enneads 2.9. The Gnostics here, as Porphyry clarifies, were Christian rebels from the ancient philosophy, that of Plato. Plotinus critiqued this branch of Christians, but openly left the rest for his disciples to critique. The rest evidently means the rest of the critique against Christians. These could be Gnostic Christians, of course, but they might also be Christians more broadly. In this case, Porphyry could have viewed his critique of Christianity more broadly as an extension of Plotinus's more narrow critique of what seemed to be Sethian Christians. This impression is reinforced by the kind of critique Porphyry first accomplished. While still a student of Plotinus, Porphyry proved that the Christian book of Zoroaster was, as he says, entirely recent, spurious, and made up. His later critique of the book of Daniel in the Bible can be seen as an extension of this earlier work of literary and historical criticism. Porphyry had become a detector and exposer of Jewish and Christian forgeries. Armed with literary critical knowledge from Longinus and philosophical acumen from Plotinus, Porphyry set out to write the longest, most learned, and most punishing critique of Christianity the world had yet known. When exactly Porphyry wrote Against the Christians is unknown, but any date between 275 and 305 seems reasonable. Porphyry used Callinicus Sutorius's History of Alexandria, which had only been completed in 270 or 271. We should reasonably allow a few years for it to circulate and reach Porphyry in Sicily or Rome. My own sense is that Porphyry's work fits the cultural climate of the Emperor Diocletian, who reigned between 284 and 305. This was a time when Diocletian and his imperial colleagues were debating how to deal with Christians who despised Greco-Roman gods and customs. I don't believe that Porphyry himself was invited to be an advisor in Diocletian's court. Still, Porphyry wrote during a time when political interest in Christianity was high, since emperors desired to unite their subjects under one common Hellenic religion. Porphyry evidently wrote his work for a small circle of philosophical and political elites who shared Porphyry's overall concern that the growth of the Christian movements represented a threat to Hellenic culture. The 40-year period between 260 and 300 wasn't by any means peaceful for the empire as a whole, but it was a period in which the Roman rulers basically left Christians alone. So during this period, Christians continued to grow, not only in numbers, but in intellectual sophistication. Christian growth in Rome must have disturbed Porphyry, who wrote that the gods no longer visit the city and afford it public benefits as long as Jesus is worshipped, evidently by Christians within the city. Porphyry believed that the Christian way of life was against Roman law and Hellenic custom, but in what survives, he nowhere recommends state-sponsored repression of Christianity. Ever the philologist, Porphyry focused his attacks on Christian scripture, including the Jewish writings adopted or appropriated by Christians. Christians of all stripes were seriously bothered by these attacks, as can be gathered from the early Catholic counterpunch. Methodius of Olympus, who died about 311, wrote 1 volume against Porphyry. Eusebius of Caesarea wrote 25 volumes, and Apollinaris of Laodicea wrote 30. Evidently, Porphyry became more dangerous as the early 4th century progressed, because his works could be used by politicians who did institute anti-Christian persecution. But despite Constantine's orders, Porphyry's works were not completely destroyed. There were still parts of Porphyry's work that Christian intellectuals found useful and indeed adapted plentifully for their own ends. Now, here I also want to offer my critique of previous editions in English of Porphyry's Against the Christians. R.J. Hoffman's 1994 book, Porphyry Against the Christians, The Literary Remains, suggests that he reconstructs Porphyry's great work. But what Hoffman actually does is to provide extracts from another work, that of Macarius Magnes, called the Apocriticus or Monogenes. Now, Macarius was probably a late 4th century writer from Asia Minor, modern Turkey. He constructed a fictional debate between himself and an anonymous Hellene, that is to say, an educated Greek opponent of Christianity. This opponent raised a series of questions, mostly based on passages of Scripture. Since the days of the German historian Adolf von Harnack, it has become common to identify the anonymous Hellene of Macarius with Porphyry. But Hoffman was well aware of scholars who attacked this view. Their criticism wasn't simply that the Hellene presents arguments that are sometimes pedantic and forced. It's mostly because Macarius simply never says that the Hellene was Porphyry, whose name Macarius knew. And when we compare the undisputed remains of Porphyry's work, most of it doesn't replicate or confirm what is spoken by Macarius's Hellene. Partially, this is because the Hellene isn't actually a real person, but a fictional amalgamation of several ancient opponents of Christianity. What's odd about Hoffman's reconstruction is that he shows no interest in any of the commonly accepted fragments and testimonies of Porphyry. In 1916, Harnack collected 97 fragments, 52 of them from Macarius. But Hoffman only translated extracts from Macarius, leaving the other, more certain fragments completely untranslated. Thus, right from the start, Hoffman's reconstruction of Porphyry's work is a halfway house. And if one rejects Hoffman's unargued intuition that the Hellene does in fact represent Porphyry, then Hoffman's book actually doesn't give us anything from Porphyry at all. Now, in all fairness, I do think that some of Porphyry's thought, if not his words, is preserved in the Hellene of Macarius. At the same time, Hoffman's reconstruction of Porphyry's work is deeply misleading because, frankly, it isn't a reconstruction, but a selective translation of Macarius. The only parts of the Hellene speech that can safely be attributed to Porphyry are those parts that overlap with the undisputed or accepted Porphyrian material, fragments and testimonies that are actually marked as coming from Porphyry. Now, the other edition of Against the Christians from Robert Berchman in 2005 would seem to remedy the problems of Hoffman's translation because it includes material beyond Macarius. But if Hoffman's book contained far too little Porphyry, then Berchman's edition contains far too much, 215 fragments from 18 different authors. He begins by selectively excerpting other works of Porphyry, not Against the Christians. And then, when he excerpts patristic authors, he translates material from authors who never mention Porphyry, at least in the immediate context. He does not distinguish between a fragment of Porphyry's own words, a testimony that paraphrases Porphyry, and doubtful material that may or may not be traced back to Porphyry. Some of his material is marred by mistranslation or misattribution. Since Berchman's edition, moreover, more fragments have been identified from the likes of Michael Sellis, Michael Glycus, Bar Hebraeus, among others. Now, although I grant that it is useful to cull all kinds of anti-Christian arguments from a variety of late antique authors like Arnobius of Sica and Augustine of Hippo, it's misleading to identify all of this material as Porphyrian and as taken specifically from Porphyry's work Against the Christians. To date, the best edition of Against the Christians is that published by Matthias Becker. Since it was published in German, however, it is inaccessible to the English-speaking world. Becker's collection does not include any Macarian material in its presentation of 81 fragments and testimonies, duly distinguished. Macarius is also not found in the following 51 uncertain citations and allusions to Porphyry's work, the doubtful material or dubia. One must peruse Becker's notes to find excerpts from Macarius's Hellene. Arguably, some of this Macarian material should have been put into the collection itself, whether in the accepted or doubtful material. So, what am I trying to accomplish by putting out a new English translation and reconstruction of Porphyry's work? Well, first, I aim to translate the full set of fragments and testimonies collected by Becker, who was a careful and meticulous editor. Since my own work isn't really intended for scholars, I don't provide anything like a full commentary on this material, but for the authentic fragments and testimonies, I do provide a condensed set of notes as a guide for your interpretation. Those who want access to the original language quotations must go read Becker. My second aim is to do something Becker didn't do, that is, actually to reconstruct what remains of Porphyry's Against the Christians. This is accomplished in part 2 of my work, and in this reconstruction I include Macarian material that overlaps with the accepted fragments and testimonies. I invite all of you to go grab this book, which will give you access to one of the most proficient attacks on Christianity from one of the greatest minds of late antiquity. The link to the book is in the description. Thank you for your support.